그래. 나도 먼저 대화 되바다 동음이 봐야지. 지산 대화 안에 띵기 대화디 토고 그래. 지산다 동아디 땡네 매가 자원이 매가 쉬고 그러봐. 되네기 동아 자원이 매가 쉬야다. 아니 띵기 대화 토외기 탑람디 아니 신 친구비 토네 죽토야 요 말해지. 아니 가르치고 그래서는 나 삼로 땅제 삼리 토네 아니 삼로 나로려야 삼로 마리비는 꽤 삼로 너르디게 봐 매바스 데네 삼로 상보 지디게 아니 지 삼로 상보디기야 공제고 공패도 땅제 아니 데네기 토냐가지 띵이 되어 주야 당 동아 탐제단 자와데 탑람 두 삼로되는 주고 그래서 지사다 삼로되는 주고와 인자다 삼로 땅나디 간에 주 당고에서는 하든 망아주게 로션도 님비게 돈에 단내기 태베 심지어 탐지게 된데 띵이 대화 토야 탈도 산지고 뭐 토야디 태바 침비 아니 잠니제 동반이도 베시라라서 봐 장슈심라서 냠솔린지 토보고 그래서 대자 되내기 토야래야 되내 냠솔린 난게 림바디 근데 된세 뒤유고네 도시네 숨기 인세 로저 되는 마디는 돈에가서 가산에 도시네 디고 쉬고래.
Good morning. So all of us here are together with the same motivation. We want to be happy. We do not want to suffer. This is the motivation behind everything that being say, do, or think. But the happiness that we've experienced thus far has only ever been transient. It arises and it passes. And therefore, we've always been left yearning for more, because we've been left unfulfilled. The only way to attain the happiness that we yearn for, which is a lasting, stable happiness, a happiness that doesn't fluctuate, that isn't punctuated by problems or difficulties, is to completely eradicate suffering and its causes. When suffering and its causes have been completely eradicated, person abides in lasting happiness. There is no cause for their happiness to be punctuated. And to attain such a state, no matter what material transformation there is in the world, or for oneself, this will not lead to the attainment of lasting happiness. No matter how excellent our outer circumstances are, the material circumstances in our lives, cannot lead to lasting happiness. The only way lasting happiness can be achieved is through the radical transformation of our way of thinking, the radical transformation of our mind. So how to do so? Well, that is the subject matter of this text. It is through training in the Mahayana Dharma, in particular the minds of bodhicitta and the wisdom realizing emptiness, that one comes to achieve a state of lasting happiness.
네네 자다 안주 가서 쉬어야지. 당주 샘 삼바상보 나네 초도 교바데데 니지 첨보데레스 제산 개화 탐지게 자와 중에 니 첨보레스 니 첨비기 연내 마시 안디네 렌디젤량 아주 가서 소스네다 냠면 제발 태바 침비시 냠면 제발로 온도디 장고 그래서 안데 온도데 그래서네 다 온도데 주위 추주 섬다 직제 온도 직제 안디가라 안 다르제 된 체와 섬다 되네 안에 지게 단죄디야 안에 지긴 유나见了的중화자 긴 몽부여바의 치위긴 몽부여바자 되네 남친 개발며 삼다 안에 도신 삼다 되네 치네 매번 미루어자 개와치 링고에다다 개와 안로의 된도 일에 개와 매반자데 개와 치마다 된도 개와 레야기 어도신의 개와 두고리에서 다디 아주게 내 원조의 삼다나 직제
We started to look at the text yesterday, and I quoted some verses from Chandakirti, in which it was explained that all the outcomes of the path, these come about independent on great compassion. Great compassion is to be recognized as the foundation of all the good qualities of the Buddha Dharma. But whilst great compassion is the foundation of all the great qualities of the Buddha Dharma, great compassion requires its own specific set of causes to be cultivated. And those are the preliminary practices. So we looked at them in the first point of the 7 yesterday. So the preliminary practices, I presented them in 2 parts. The first is that of recognizing this remarkable opportunity that has been achieved. And this is done through recognizing the 18 freedoms and endowments that we have each achieved, and that these have come about independence on causes. This is an important recognition, because if something has come about independence on causes, it means that those causes, they were accumulated, they met ripening conditions, ripened, and they will eventually cease or fade and cease, which means this rebirth is impermanent. Moreover, to achieve a similar rebirth again requires the cultivation of the required causes once again. So here, in the recognition of the precious human rebirth, we bring this together with the understanding of dependence arising and impermanence. This then leads us also to reflect on the impermanence of this life, this precious opportunity, and recognize that one of the remarkable features of a precious human rebirth is that we uniquely have the capacity to cultivate the causes that can lead to liberation and enlightenment. But this opportunity is finite. It is always heading towards its ending. And there are so many causes that can come and lead to its ending, and very few that can sustain it. So therefore one needs to make the most of this opportunity whilst one has it. So this is the first set of preliminaries.
가상 시반하신 개와 침방 원료 고본 토야에 들려 아니 유로지 간에 싸기를 남나 당저 군로리아 개와 침마 당 원료 고본 원료 하다 미고본디 토부 하다 미고본 토반에 띵들이야 탈바다 템지 김비기 남냠네 지야 소소의 체디 동아시아 된 디규주야 차상 주도에 띵 개발진제레스 대자 개와 침마이네 원료 고본 토구도 선비기다 토미오 토도기 돈이 뒷바께 되네 원료 고본 토비 칠도 유디 가르쳐 왔으나 되네 아니 융아 26권에 샬라 내가 지금에 선비게 당한도 도신 수름 써야 되다 아 개와 정 원료 고본 토비 유체고래 먼저 내 수름 송 되네 원료 고본 땡들어야 야 튕겨 약보 영향에 체 된다라 다 튕기 매나 밀리 톱나 다 튕기 매나 강한 식으로 제사 되네 자 튕기 약보 영향 된다라 수수 체텔이야 수수 류 롱주 토네 소설에 현리에 진배 가르치 다토나 다에게 냠는 제야되다 개와 침매는 원료 고본 토비 땡들라 아니 롱주 영향 유리디래 안 개와 침매 땡들라 연락 탄저 참와 근데 도다 댐바 시시데 댐바 영향디 도다 댐바 시시 댐바 뉴버 첨부 시시 댐바 도다 댐바세는 원보 참와 도다 댐바 닝지고 아니 시시 댐바세는 소수기 가르레가 제외나 자월람로 뉴버 이고 안데니가 영향 된다라 세베냠네 제야데레스 아니 개와 침마 아니 저기 아직 철이야 최념는 제라 아니 지 거보용하다 최념는 제 야고용하야라야 체델이야 최념는 제를 준비 좀 해야 되레스 아니 안데니기 안디가리아 아주 개와 침마 원조 거봐 토버 쇼세베기다 지게 라마다 제 되네 최념는 제 원조 거봐 토버 쇼세 몰람 해야 되레스 지난디 아주 개와 침마 원조 거봐 토비 규리 디레다 원조 거봐 돈이 되니 육군로지게 되네 디토네 수rim송 진바다 쇠보고 되네 전주 점야데 개와치면 온도고 봐도 비교해다니 온도 두스제베이네다 아주 디냠는 제반 삼노나래 디삼로 베시 담바이나 더 개와치면 온도고 봐 토비 규사고래
So to talk a little further about the preliminaries, when one is engaging in the reflection on precious human rebirth, reflecting that it has come about independence on causes, therefore it is impermanent, therefore I need to utilize this opportunity well. That reflection on recognizing it's come about independence on causes also reminds one that I need to accumulate similar causes to ensure I continue to have excellent rebirths. So this then comes with the understanding of I need to utilize this life well. How to do so? Part of that is to accumulate excellent causes for ongoing good rebirths. So what are these good rebirths? What are the causes for good rebirths? So firstly, one has to develop a motivation to have another excellent rebirth as a human or as a god, one of those types of gods who can practice the Dharma. And to develop such a focused mind requires a turning away of the unimportant pleasures, the trivial pleasures that dominate our mind so, and the unimportant problems that dominate our mind so, these things that are tied to this life, and rather lift our focus to what is important. Now, in this preliminary practice, we are starting to train our mind to let go of what has no value, to recognize what has no value and let go of that, to recognize that what has value is not today's problems and pleasures, but to accumulate causes for excellent rebirths. So from this explanation, hopefully you see how this is the precious reflection on precious human rebirth is a preliminary for the later attainments of the Mahayana as well. But staying here with precious human rebirth, the causes that one then sets about accumulating is firstly that of ethical restraint. So ethical restraint at this level is primarily restraining one's physical and verbal behavior from doing harm, to ensure that the way we act and the way we speak does not bring harm. And to some extent, we try and refrain the motivating mind too. That's the first cause, ethical restraint. The second is so that we can ensure that in future lives, we have excellent material circumstances. We do not experience a hindrance to our spiritual growth through having insufficient material circumstance. We need to accumulate the causes for that. This comes through the practice of generosity. The practice of generosity is expressed in many ways, but it comes about to developing an attitude of wanting to give what we have in abundance to others, to be of benefit to others by giving of ourselves to them. And in this way, we create causes for excellent rebirths. And then the third cause that needs to be accumulated is to ensure that we can continue in future lives to have all these qualities, physical qualities that we've attained with this rebirth, that we are of good health, that our sense faculties are unimpeded, and as well as having easily getting on with others, having good relations, we need to accumulate those causes. And this is the practice of patience, a mind that is unsubdued in the face of adversity. And here we are starting to develop the mind of patience by letting go of what has no importance, this life's, the attainment of this life's pleasures, the complaining about this life's problems. Letting go of that aids our cultivation of patience. So that's the third cause. The fourth is delighting in our Dharma endeavors. This is the mind of joyous perseverance. So here we are creating the causes to have a mind that is naturally inclined to virtue, a mind that is naturally ethical, naturally generous, naturally patient, a mind that delights in doing what is good, what is right, rather than having a personality inclined to deceit, for example. So this is the fourth cause, the mind of enthusiastic perseverance. And the fifth and final is that of making prayers to continue to meet the Dharma, to continue to meet the Mahayana Dharma, one's Mahayana spiritual teachers, to have excellent rebirth, and so forth. So these then are the 5 causes that one sets about accumulating. These come with a motivation of wanting to achieve good rebirth so that one can continue one's spiritual journey, and then one sets about accumulating these 5 causes. And they are the part of the preliminaries for the later development of the goals of the Mahayana.
도시 연구가 삼다 내게 동아야지 풍부될 때내 연구가 지상하는 쪽이 깨와들 내다 녀모 와이와 된 동아이 라시 바들에서 대양 규단 게임에 발로 주어 말에 규단 게임 가를 때내 연구를 삼다도 요 내다 녀모 발라든지 기고를 해서지 도 삼다 다 녀모 발이 기유나 녀모 바디야 안에 간스 기고를 때 녀모 바디야 되죠 콘롤라서 방아야로 녀모 받쳐서 은자와 다시 마리파 세트니 기고를 해서지 언도시는 삼다무리스 언도시는 니가 상한테 데니기다 저기 동아 코알에 깨야 동아야 규조 녀몽바디 녀몽바디야 저와 다세 마릭바디를 끼고래스 다세 마릭바디 가능시 세야신네 나한줄라 다 나세 삼로 땅여디 나디 가능시는 거래스네 나세야디 풍부하당 내지게 풍부하라 마디오 강라야 마디오 코롱원이 줍되게 샬라 마디오 코롱원이 줍되고 있는 거래스 나와 나신이가 되는 진주가 삼로 주어래스 니 진은 딜라 다세 마릭바세 딜라 거래스 지사당은 좀 녀모바 탐지기 얘기 규자와의 딜레스 니 방고 거래스 제가 정말 어디 원도 디고 삼다디 지시로다
And the second set of preliminaries, and we also looked at this yesterday, is that to recognize that we encounter problems, suffering, and difficulties is just a natural experience of being bound in samsara. So this is the reflection, firstly, on true sufferings and then true origins, where we recognize that every samsaric being will continue to experience unwanted circumstances, pain and difficulty, from physical illness to mental challenges. One continues to experience such problems because one is bound in samsara. This then points to the cause. We have these contaminated aggregates, our body and mind, the physical and mental aggregates. As long as we have these, which are naturally subject to suffering, we will suffer. As long as, to say it again, one has contaminated aggregates, body and mind, we will continue to suffer. It is a natural result of having these aggregates. And that we have these aggregates, the body and mind, has come about independence on causes. This is now moving from true sufferings to true origins. And those causes are ripening of contaminated karma, which was accumulated under the influence of afflictions. And of these two causes, karma and afflictions is primary. And amongst the many afflictions, they're the very root cause of this entire sequence that ends in having contaminated aggregates and experiences of suffering. The very root cause of this is our ignorance of self-grasping, or the ignorance of true grasping. So we spoke about this yesterday. We also spoke about how to come to recognize the ignorance of self-grasping or true grasping. There, the first step, or the step is in this meditation, is to try to come to recognize how the self appears to the mind. And the way that the self naturally appears to us is we think of ourselves as being independent of everything. That this sense of self, this unchanging, this has the second quality of being unchanging, and the first was independent. That the self, this I that always existed, this is not dependent on anything, but independent of it. This is how it appears. It is then believed to be true, or correct, or real, and grasped at. The mind then grasps at it in this way. So true grasping, or grasping at the self-grasping. And this is not how the self exists. Therefore, it's an ignorance. This consciousness is not in accordance with reality. It's an ignorance. It's an ignorance that is grasping at the self, or grasping at the self as being truly existent. This then is the meaning of the term self-grasping or true grasping, and how we need to come to recognize it.
Dene 당고시 삼다에도 에너지게 가르레스니 다천남 밀람 더블 삼세도 당고시 삼다도 갑라 다니냠네 집에 갈라 동반 이고 삼 제바치아디레세 다디 동반 이 제바자 갈스리고르스네 제사다 나 라신 주바 나 갈라 랑몬 주바 나와나 짐바리다 우인이수 짐바나 신된의 요래 요 말에 센 다지 심주 제바체레도 동반이라 제바체도 거래 제사다 nga sayadi ganglaya ma rang nguyne zhuba nawa naxinji ndu mindu samje jeba chidi na milam chenam tabar samsidi da dongbanyi la jeba chedi samdani chagore.
Thereafter, we started to look at the main body of the text, so the second of the 7 points. This here is translated as the main practice, and it starts with cultivating the wisdom understanding emptiness, or wisdom understanding reality. So here, one takes any phenomenon, such as the self, comes to recognize how it appears to our mind, and then we need to investigate, does it exist in the way that it appears or not? Because how things appear to us, we believe they exist in this way. So we need to check whether it does or not. So in this process, we are examining whether something exists in reality in the way that we believe it to, in the way that it appears to us. And this is how we then eventually come to realize emptiness.
Zanda dusine jeba chitu kabla nganzu dade tambu milam chena milam tabu sam sidu yu songwadi songwale ya ane songwadi rashin nawa nashin lole yu dige nawa nashin du midu jeba chede songware dene wo chikdile magi ribi shila je sede da yushin toya yu toya nasa yushin sheba le ya ane rashin juba du midu sheba chede chagore Rangshin Sheba Koran Yujin de la Rangshin Juba Re, Temper Juba Rema Jeba Che, Tadi, Chenam Minum Jubur Tabasams Yudi, Sunwa the Zimba Sechua, Sunwa Sedi, Sheba de Na Yudi, and the Rangu when the Juba Nawa Nashin do a Midu sometime. Di Yujin Sheba Koran, Nang Rang when the Juba Yore Yomar Sheba Che, Chagore. Sunwa the Zimba Sedi, Sunwa Sedi Yudi. The Zimba said you to Toya Yuchen Lo, let it go there. And Chenam, that Chenam, that was some said you lose what is here. I did.
So in the second point, there are 10 subpoints. So the first subpoint is about considering all phenomena as being like a dream. So whilst it says all phenomena, we should understand here it refers to the object of consciousness. In other words, what is appearing to consciousness. This is the meaning of all phenomena in this instance. So it refers to the object of consciousness, or it's more commonly would be translated as the apprehended, what is apprehended by consciousness. So that's the meaning of all phenomena here. And one thinks of them as being like a dream. The second of these 10 subpoints analyze the nature of consciousness that is without beginning. Here, we look at consciousness itself, or the subject, or the apprehender, and whether it exists, whether consciousness itself exists truly, inherently, in the way that it appears, or not. So the primary difference between these first 2 points is the first point refers to either, you could call it the object or the apprehended, and the second you can call subject or the apprehender, whether they exist in the way they appear or not, whether they exist truly or inherently or not.
Diring yaja chik roshubi na kanchele ngānsuliya yūla semla nāngi tā tāngpo ngānsuki nyamlin jeba chebi kabla tāngpo susi tēndu samdāng chukpo res, jeba chekpo res, chisa ngāse di tēndu che. Dēne an di nyamnyong hā kōyōdu chi yu ane shen, kānsā shen na chi yu ngōpa la sopa ane jeba chēndu chekpo res or chekpo. Chisa di tāngpo susi tēndu nyamlin chekpo res or da.
Just to say, first as an aside, as a translator, yesterday I couldn't remember the translation apprehender and apprehended, so I referred to object and object possessor, which is synonymous here, but the actual term is apprehender and apprehended, which is what I've remembered now for today. Now to come to what Gedna has just said. So yesterday, we came to the main practice, training the two-body treaters, and we looked very briefly at the first 2 points here. The first being the apprehended, the object, and the second being the apprehender, the consciousness. So let's look at these 2 points again. So repeating a little bit of what we looked at, what I mentioned yesterday, is that when one meditates on emptiness, it's recommended that one starts with oneself. How do I appear to my mind? Thereafter, one can move on to other phenomena, such as other people, and other, say, material phenomena, or things other than the self. One starts with oneself, and thereafter moves to the selves of others, or any other phenomenon. The first step in the meditation is of great importance, and this is to try to recognize how the I appears to us. The way that and this needs to be recognized well, it is difficult to do because it's not something we've thought about, but nevertheless it continuously is there. So the I, how does it appear? So the way it appears is as if it is, and I'll use different words, but to describe the same thing, independent or unrelated or separate from the aggregates. So the aggregates refers to our body and our various minds. So the self appears to not be dependent on them, to be not even related to them, to be separate. So the self appears to be separate from the body, separate from the mind, unrelated to them, independent of them.
다 셈레 로스메 되어제와 난고르스네 그런 난고르스네 지나서 셈레 초와 누가게 요도 누가 시스템디 가가체 내가 저와 메디겐 누가 용한 가사치 요바르스는 거래 대화치 요데 가서 대화 대회 셈들 저와 메디겐 디네 디기 요된 초와 누가다 초와 대화도 용한 용한보 가사 아니 지금 델레 저와 메디 로스 요바지 는 거래 안섬 소와 둥아 뇨도 갑랑 한 둥아 강에 두럽디 둥아 요야 둥아 소와 둥아 대당 가사 용한 이 저와 메디게 가사 둥아 용한지 이어바지는 거라 가서래 근데 나 대우도럽디 소와 디기치 소와 대화지난 저와 메디게 가사 소와 대화 용한 주좀 공고래 데니스 나와 셔고라 가서래 배는 가서래 미치기 잘라지 겹로 켜줘봐 있나 잘라지다 미니디 저와 메디로와 저와 된시 저의 제메 된시 가서 잘라디 샤샤지 미디가 와정나 좋아요래 잘라디 메치나 미디가 지금 말해 미디가 와 줘베네 잘라디 샤나 코니 잘라디 미 쿨키겐 미디당 쿨니버디 제메 된시 냠도 주고 제메 된시 여러 안서 삼나라 디나이스 거래 안지 초류 수보 류이데당 초와 둥아단 대화 셰바티게 쿨나신지 쿨나네 겹로게 잘라 도도에 쿨치고다 니나신지 디네 먼저 나세디 쿨케 잘라게 미나신지 디네 기능 거라 나래 삼나래 디네 중고래 디니 다 쿨당 쿠코는 가자니데 제메 되셔와 혼이 자와메로와다 고 제메 되셔와 쿨디 가르치베네 가사들네 마 가사 가르치 쿨들네 마 혼이 제메 되셔라 지상 안주 삼나라 가르스는 잘라 수부대다 류당 셈니디 쿨나신체 데네 나세디 쿨케행게 가사 나신지 데네지 아주 류다 셈레 저와 메데베시 난고레스 다디 나와 나신지 다 두개 민두세디 제바체야 차고라 가서 저 요마르와 디니혼이 말 쿨당 가사 이디 저 제메 된셔와 쿨디디 샤샤 간사 가오 전화 줘요로와 쿨디 메자 땅샤바네 간사디 간니스가요 말와 다 코롱 쿨디 케르네 케요로와 이네 쿨당 쿨 키겐 간사 있네 저와 여르베스네 그건 제메 되시래 와디 걸스네 콘이 저와 요 말에 가르치는 간사 가르치는 쿨디는 내요 말에 쿨디 가르치는 간사 되네요 말와 로 잘라디 근데 잘라디 디 샤샤 줘바나 다디 잘라디 미지 케 줘바나 콘이 잘라디 디 샤샤 간사 코롱 가와 전화 줘쳐줘와 잘라디 셔디 잘라디 메시베네 간사 되는 가요 말와 아니 간사 듣고 디 파워로 시소는 잘라디는 내스가요 말 콘이 제메 된셔 저요 말 콘이 제메 된셔 제사단 디 나신지 가서 마주 풍보다 셈디 쿨 나신지 다 마주 나세도 쿨 키게 가사 나신지 삼로 나래 디니시 는 거래 저와 메디 제메 된시 는 거래 이내 된달리 차고 말와 제사 제메 된시 는 거래 디 나신 는 거래 제다 삼로 나래 세월에 샤세
Trying to come to recognize how the I appears. So this is then presented to you, and then one in meditation needs to come to recognize this for oneself. So the I, the self, appears as if it is separate from the body, separate from the mind. We can say separate, unrelated, not dependent. So for example, we may be feeling something, say feeling happy, feeling unhappy, but it seems that the I, the person, the I appears to be different from this mind that is feeling. There seems to be something apart from these two. This I that has always been there, that has been with us throughout our life and unchanging. Now there's some feeling, but it appears a happy feeling or a suffering feeling. It appears as if it is separate, different from the mind. That this I appears to be separate, different from the mind. The analogy used is of, if we visualize a person carrying a heavy load, so someone with a heavy sack on their back, or maybe a rucksack, and they're carrying this heavy load. This person appears to not be dependent on the load, or separate, different, distinct from this heavy load they're carrying, this heavy rucksack. In that, they can put it down and the person can go on, now unaffected by that load. So this is how the person appears to us, as if it's separate, distinct from the body and the mind, from the physical and mental aggregates.
난 두시는 나와 나신 당한 나 세대 소수 풍보를 마되바 풍보단 저 메디게 지인바 있나 다 풍보디 간사디 아니 간스 두시 심주치도 답변은 아주 두시네 다네 그때는 아주 네 용고 네 라바 네 강바 두세바다 다베나 다 간사디 네 라바 세대한 간사디 차고 말에 고세대한 간사디 차고 말에 데네 안디네 수부 나래 데네 직 수부 나래 샤당 차당 바바 如果都真的人삼다베나 나세데 미요마레 지산 예메레 지산 수부이데네 두스네 나네 제베나 풍보데레 로수 저와 메지게 나디 풍부이디 나래야 니요마 통고마 라교마다 풍보데레 로수 저와 메지게 나 데세디 두스네 니요마르 와세 니요마레스 풍보들 식으로 수수 풍보들 수이보다 먼저게 나세데 된디게 풍보를 저와 메베 나디 나나와 나신 누에 메도 제바 치료다 먼저 가와도진 치료는 제가 제 예요 말와 당보 요새데 강반나면 잘라야 가와 두면 제고로 디나신데 나세데 먼저 풍보에 때도다 수이 풍보에 때도 가와 두면도 심주치 제바 있나 다 심주치에도 제사다 나 풍보들 라신다 나야나 고당 강바당 라바당 디나신다 샤 바바 차如果 강도 되는 심지에바인다 지상 딜에 되는 로스 저메되게 나세디다 연연한 통곡으로 되는 제여도 통하기네요 말에 통곡 말에 제 Chisa denigi dewa tuenshin de dewa medin gansa di da pumpe di pa zene nigi du mi du zeye di samdana di dang mo re chen.
This first step, utilizing this analogy of the person appearing to us as being like someone carrying a heavy load, the way the person appears to us, just staying with this analogy, is as if the person is in charge of the load. The person is like, in charge of the load. Can place the load here, can place the load there, continue to carry it, not carry it. The person is in charge. And in this way, unrelated to the load, there's not this mutual dependency between them. The person is in charge of it. So this is the first step in the meditation, to try to come to recognize how the I appears. So the I appears as if it is separate from the aggregates, but can utilize the aggregates. Like a master and servant, this kind of thing. So where can, if the I does exist separate from the aggregates in the way that it appears, so similar to the person who's choosing or not choosing to carry the load, then the person, the I, should be found somewhere. And the person can only be found in one of two places, either together with the aggregates, the body and mind, or separate from them. So out in the bush. So that it's easy to dismiss that the person is not to be found with the aggregates. The person must be here with the aggregates, with the body and mind, because so the person must be here with the body and mind. Therefore, now we come to the second step, that of investigation. We're not going to look for this independent person, which is the way the person appears. The I appears as if it's independent. We're not going to look for it out there, but we're going to look for it here with the aggregates. So we start then with the physical aggregate, the form aggregate, the body. So does this independent person that is separate, distinct of the body aggregate, can it be found then abiding within the body? So we investigate the body through its various parts, and we imagine placing various body parts around us and asking ourselves, the hand that is over there, is that the I? Is this the I that I've always identified with? Of course not. So we divide the body into all its parts, the various limbs, then the bits underneath, the fluids and the flesh and the bones, and we see we are none of these. And even down to the tiniest parts, with its hormones and the rest of it. Are any of these, if I isolate it out and place it over there, can I say, I found the I. It's that body part, that substance. And we cannot find it, cannot find this separate I, this distinct I within the body at all.
통고 말 이거 말에 다디 많이 봐나 다 낭삼로 된다 삼로 나도 여러 배스네 다 삼로되다 삼로래 제와 메디게 삼로래 뒤에 신이 나디 다 두신 삼로되는 뒤에서 제바제도 다디네 저기 초와 대화 동화 당념 삼로되는 시도 초와 대화 유디 갑라 되네게 초한 대화 딜레 로속에다 나세 동화 용한 가사 뒤에서 제바제다 되네 초와 동화 딜레 로도 동화 용한 가사 저와 메디게 가사 뒤에서 제바제도 다디네 제바지도 초와 동아세다 데 대화세다 딜레 셴비게 자메디게 가사디 다 세미티네 이거 말에 진짜 많이 되다 가르치 와서 가르삼당 가르두 제바 많이도 어다 풍보 류당 낭 셈리아 저와 메디게 아니 즉 나세디 코르 켜게 나신 류셈르 저와 메디 마드비 하디 민도아 삼비게 삼로실리고다 삼로리고래.
So the first step of the meditation is to see how the self appears, and then to look to find it is the second step. In the second step, we're looking within the aggregates. There, we first look within the body, going through the various body parts. Despite identifying with them, we cannot find the I within the body at all. So then, if we can't find the I in the body, surely who I am has to be found within my personality, my mind. So the mind then can be divided in various ways. So if we take the division of the aggregates, we look at the feeling aggregates and say, can the I be found in any of the feelings? So feelings are in Buddhism, they present, the term is used differently from English. So the feelings are threefold: the feeling of happiness, the feeling of suffering, or neutral feelings. So if we take any of these and we look, am I that particular consciousness, say a happy feeling? And we very quickly come to recognize that no individual consciousness can be identified as ourselves. So it's just like when we divided the body into various parts and couldn't find the self there, so too when we divide consciousness. I cannot be, say, a consciousness of a happy feeling because I'm not always happy, but I always have a sense of self. So therefore, I cannot find the I in consciousness either. This then leads to the conclusion that the I does not exist in the way that it appears. To express it differently, the I does not exist as something separate from the body and mind, like the person carrying the load, who is completely in charge and can place it here, there, or anywhere. The person is, the I does not exist in this way.
Andu samdang da phungbo dang sugi phungbo da nang semla de miteba de mege jame de ngadi du sinse de manye de nyi go mare manye ba na da nga meba rebesa na nga meba na mare nga duguye nga saguye nga dewa nyongo nga kibudo nga kibu minisebe da denike nga nyoya de nga jugi nyoye dugo ro ba sa kugo ro ba cha nga meba na mare nga dus ta kanis du la bidu kasan shiba na singa to chisa nga sede nga duguye nga dede nga ya lang de sede du shin samda de ga nga de sede de bi sede nga sede nga zu phungbo del ya an de gugya ma da je de bi ring de la phungbo la de che ne nga de ge se phungbo la de ne sha gi du nga chi sha gi du phungbo la jawa me ba ma phungbo la de ne di ga ba nga de se be nga de dang de phungbo ni la ngo la ye wa che me de gen ngo ye wa che be phungbo da ngo ta de ba me de gen ani po chik du se ngo ta de ba me ba jawa me ba ma yin ba phungbo di de gang sa di de se ye wa che na she me de gen je sa nga di phungbo de la de ne sha gi du se je sa da nga du gu ye la de phungbo de gu je da je ro de ka la ta nga du gu la de je sa nga du gu se de phungbo le de phungbo yu gu je ba de la de ne nga du gu sha gi du as je sa phungbo le de ne du ya ma to nga di phungbo su yi phungbo la ma de ba nga shi min du se an di na xin sam lo na da ba na 초와 소소기 초와 동안지 요데 갑라 오 nga 나기 두세야 돼. 진짜 nga 기분 믿으셔야 돼. 나디 초와 동안들 되네. 나디 시작이 두스. 다 초와 디기지 기부 줘도 갈 nga 대부도 nga 기부들라도 초와 대화들 되네 시작이 두스. 진짜 nga 세야지 랑기 풍보 수기 풍보다 낭 셰발로 되네. 샤바지마도 낭 셰바 되네 시작이 두와서 되네지. 다 두째바지도 아주 nga 세지 여바데리 다 가르치 요래스네 풍보를 뛰네 풍보던 제어여바 풍보를 뛰네 샤바 풍보던 오지바 이바 대랑게 셈을 뛰네 샤바 셈을 오지바 셈을 뛰 풍보다 지도 셈 풍보다 셈라야 뛰는 주바시에도 와서 비기다 되는 자고 거르다 시바레 셈다 오지 여와 체메죠. 제사다 나세데 풍보를 뛰네 샤바 셈을 뛰네 샤고도 뛰네 주고도 선비 삼로직 다 하고 거든 제바지.
The first step of the meditation, how does the object, in this case the self, appear? The second step is to investigate, looking to see if it exists in the way that it appears, and of the many methods of investigation or techniques, we here looked for the self, if it exists, can be found to exist in the body or in the mind. So that's the second step, that of investigation. Comes then to the third, which is the conclusion, which is that the self does not exist in the way that it appears to the mind, which here we use the illustration of a person carrying a heavy load. The person is seen as separate, distinct from not dependent on the load. The person is different from the load. The person is in charge of the load. But no such self can be found. So this is the third step, that the self does not exist in the way that it appears. So that has been mentioned thus far. Now the fourth step. So if the self does not exist in the way that it appears, does this mean the self doesn't exist? This cannot be possible, because I know I exist. I have experience of existing. So this now is the fourth step. Then how does the self exist? Because in that third step, we came to recognize the self does not exist in the way that it appears. That's the third step, that recognition. The fourth step is, well, then how does the self exist? Because as we heard yesterday, we can say, I am sitting, I am listening, I am feeling excited, I'm feeling confused. All of this we can say. So we talk in reference to ourselves, we experience ourselves. So the way, now in the fourth step, we would come to recognize the way the self does exist is merely imputed onto the aggregates, onto the body and mind. Which means that the I and the aggregates are of the same entity, of the same essence. They are not of a distinct or separate entity or essence. Therefore, if one's not feeling so well, then independence on this feeling, one can impute, I am unwell. Or if you have a pain in your leg, I have a pain in my leg. In either case, we are imputing our self, our I, our sense of self, onto into the body, because we're saying my leg is paining, or onto a feeling, an unhappy feeling. This then is how the self does exist. It is merely or only or just imputed onto the aggregates, the body or the mind.
Nene, tatu chena samdang ide, jisadang, nga se di pungpo dang, shepa le tuyne zhuba, tuyne shaba yedwa sanpe samdang haku ide, dene, deshi nga zu samdang nangla karlewa sene nga se di pungpo dang, nang pungpo dang, sem gang lai ma tuwa rangu ide zhuba, zhutuba dida, nawa na shinjik, dene ki pungpo dang, sem gang lai ma tuwa rangu ide zhuba, nawa na shinjik zawa ide minduwa sanpe ke samlo dida, rangu ide nawa na shi rangu ide zhuba di mindu sanpe ke samlo ngeba tempo shinye yodu, dende tongpa nyi se de haku wari yesi wardai.
So when one goes through this meditation and one is experienced and thereby accomplishing each step well, one will then come to the conclusion that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, which is as separate, distinct, independent of the body and mind aggregates, but is rather empty of existing in this way. This then is the wisdom realizing emptiness. So first, one needs to come to understand this well, and secondly, one needs to engage in this meditation many times.
Nga se gang lai ma tuwa rangun de nawa na zawa gini mindu sempe hao samlo di, da di mindu zawa gini mindu sempe samlo di da, du sin yane yando kumgu kuchi kazi nyuba shuk che rodu, ranzu liya rangun wani juba, nawa na chi yore sempe samlo di ma shuk chun shuk warda. Di ma shuk chun rodu, duesha kiya nyung rita, kondra kiya nyung rita, ngaje kiya nyung rita, nyomo kiya nyung rita warda.
By coming to understand this meditation and understand the various points of them, in particular that first step, how the self appears, And then engaging this meditation many times, coming to recognize that the way the self appears to me, it does not exist like this. It is empty of existing like this. As one comes to become ever more familiar with this and it starts to have more of an impact on one's mind, the ignorance that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears, this starts to weaken. And as it weakens, proportionately, the afflictions that come from that ignorance, that result from that ignorance, attachment, anger, pride, jealousy, these all start to proportionately weaken.
Lolia Nanzamato, Dunla Lambuchi, Yomar was. She's a Milam Nikos night, Milam Nari, Mother Dunla, Shimjina Yomar. Tinashi, Ma setting us nine, Kala Yamato Rangun to Nangore, now at the Milan Nashi, Shimujina, Dunla Yomares. Tinashenda, to Chilogo soup, Jiro Raja, you Karina Lola, now you do, Kala Yamato Rangun to Nangores. She's a now a Nashin. Don't like Kala Madio Rangun to 2 years in Chebana, Dinigi, Yomaris. She's a Kala Rangun to Nawadi, Dini Nawadi Milam Nashi, yes. She's a Milam Nashi, Lotru Wongo, Lotru Wongi, Lotruali, Tru Wongi, Kalama Rangun to Nangores. She's a Nawanaji, Dola Yomari, Milamgi, La Tata Mambosh and Milam Naji, said Chenam Nilam, there was some, so Dushin some Daja, Miss Gongo, yes.
So presented meditation in 4 steps. Then you can add the final step, a 5th step, which is now referring to the text. When we have recognized how the self appeared, we investigated, 2nd step, didn't find it, 3rd step, but recognize that the self is merely labeled by mind, 4th step. The 5th step is, therefore, the way the self appears to me is just like a dream. And in fact, it's not just the way the self appears to me. Looking at this first subpoint, the way all phenomena appear to my mind is not how they exist. So therefore, they are like a dream, similar to a dream. So this then is the 5th and final step. Just to then unpack that, explain that a little bit. When one has a dream of whatever, other people, oneself, things, they appear, whilst we are in the dream, we believe that whatever we are dreaming of exists in the way that it appears to us. We wake up and we recognize, of course, it wasn't a real house, I wasn't having that conversation. Similarly, now in my meditation, I've recognized that the self doesn't exist in the way that it appears. The way that it appears as if this is true existence. The way it appears is true, real. But I've now come to recognize it doesn't exist in this way. It's empty of existing in this way. And therefore, I can liken it to a dream. This is the case with the self. So, staying now with all phenomena, this is the case with the self. And it's the case with everything that appears to my mind. Everything that I see, the speech that I hear, the conversations that I have, everything I think about. Everything I think about for the future or the past, all of this can be likened to a dream. In that, the way it appears to me, the way I believe it to exist, is not how it exists in reality.
Songo Yudige, Lola Nawa Nashin, Rangun to Nawa Nashi, Kalama to Rangun to Nawa Nashi, Yomares, Chesada, Manzu, Yu Condition there, Kalama Rangun to Nawa, the Milam Nashi, Chimchin, Yomares, and the Canis Yores in them, she henchilo, Dune, Tawa, some Yore, 주르와 다디네 인나는 유디게 되네 메나 인나 안에 유 동반이다 강래 유 강래마도 랑원에 그 나와 자오기니 미두 선배기 통간이 셰바 동반이 또 셰바 됐어다 말이 봐세 가서 있기 셰바디 그런 안에다 랑원에 주바 레베스 요르와 요레 요 말에서 왜나 안디안 랑원에 요 말에서 마예리 베실레제 디치고 동반이 또 한게 서 대신은 저가서 유디게 나와도 주바지 요 말에라고 봐다 나와도 주바 매나 두쯤 제바자 나와도 주바 매바 통경게 동반이 또 한게 시스 제바 코롱 따라온 원의 주바지 레베스 다 코롱 유디게 나와나시 매바래 유디 제가 디니게 동반이 통을 셰바디 랑원의 주바지 레베스 지고다 레베나나 안데 디안은 랑을 보고 말해서 소야 될다 마지리 비셔라 제세다 디가래 셈 그런 거 랑기 뭘봐 시암 라신래 봐 제바제제 근데 셈 라신마로 또야지 무슨 거래다 될래 제바제야 돼.
So now we're going to look at the first and second of these subpoints. In that first subpoint, you see it ends there with the word like a dream, the term like a dream. So this points to that fifth and final step in the meditation. So the entire 5 points of the meditation is here included in that first point. So phenomena appear to us in a particular way. We investigate to see if they exist in this way. We find they are not. They are empty of existing in this way, third step. But they exist merely labeled by mind, fourth step, fifth step. So therefore, the way any phenomenon, anything that appears to my mind appears is like a dream. Doesn't exist in the way that it appears. So that's all then contained in point number 1. Point number 2 then, point number 1 is about what is apprehended or the object of consciousness. Now we go to point number 2, which is about the apprehender or the subject, the realizing consciousness. So point number 2 is about the consciousness that in this instance is the wisdom realizing emptiness. What about it? Does it exist by way of its own nature? Does it exist truly? And here too, analyze the nature. So the second point, analyze the nature of consciousness that is without beginning. So here we recognize that it too is empty of inherent existence. It too does not exist in the way that it appears.
안다네 마예 리비시라제 시 리비시스네 셰바 코롱기 모함 라실이야 제바제고레스 나제연데 그랬는데 다 되네기 동반이 최나자랑 응원이 주바 민도 선배 통견디 동반이 또 비셰랍디 코롱 안에 랑응원이 셴라마도 랑응원이 주바레 마레스 코롱 모라 제바제디 다 되네기 셰바디야 안에 지게 코롱기 가르쳐 줘서 율을 뛰고 그래. 셰바디 율을 뛰네 디토페 요 셰바샤 율을 뛰고 그래지. 근데네 셰바디암 그런 게 깨진가마다 치마를 뛰고 그래. 깨진가마를 맞대봐. 아니 시야 말. 지상 깨진가마다 치마를 뛰. 지상 되네자 되네기 셰바디암 80주 제도 코라신 그리스도 제바 제도 강라에 맞대비게 지민도 지상 되네자 깨진가마다 치마를 뛰어봐 율을 뛰는 셴을 뛰네 샤바게 다 리바치레샤 선배 삼당이도 공어 리비시 뭐 제바제 되네게 하고 해도 되네 강라에 맞다 랑응외는 루비게 강라에 맞대봐 제와야 민도 강라에 맞대봐 제와면 봐서 강라에 맞대봐 제 가봐야 민도 강라에 맞대봐 내봐야 민도 제와 가봐 내봐야 돼 제사코 제와도 유된 깨내 되는 되고 깨진가마 치마는 깨진가마를 되는 끼고 제사 율라 되는 유신의 끼샤고래 제사 율라 되는 유신 동반이 될라 되는 유동반의 되는 유신 동반이 또 별로디 될라 되는 샤고 율라 되는 샤고래 동반이 또 별로서 샤고래 율라 되는 샤고래 엔디나시 깨진가마다 치마를 되고 그래서 깨진가마를 매바 치마요야 말 치마 매바 가마요야 말 제사 되니게 삼다도 제사다 강라에마도 랑응원이 주비기 제와 마제바르샤스 마제바 되니 제와디 민두스 마제비기 마제바르스 되니 제비기 리바스메스 마제리바 도시 메바르 제사 되니에서다 되니기 셰바 대양 된 동방도 셰바 대양 신지를 뛰네 샤바마도 강라에 마도바랑 원유 주비시 샤바 자오기니 민두 선배하고 해야 될다 이그 짐바 샤바 코라 라시 마도바 하고 하는데 해서 송거래.
Just before I give Genna's explanation, still on the second point, these last words without beginning. So if you look in at other translations, the translators in other Tibetan traditions will translate this as unborn. So you'll come across this a lot in other Tibetan traditions. Analyze the nature of consciousness, which is unborn. In this tradition, we don't use that terminology. So I've translated it as without beginning. It could also be translated as, because without beginning is a meaning, literally it would be unarisen, which is you can see the link between something not arising and not being born. Anyway, so that's just saying a lot, but in Geshe's explanation, you'll see without beginning or not arising, they both will work here. Okay, now to Geshe's explanation. So the first point is about the apprehended, the object. The second point is about the apprehender, or the subject, the consciousness that is realizing that the object in the first point is empty of inherent existence. So this consciousness in the second point, the consciousness of the wisdom realizing emptiness, we need to analyze analyze the nature of consciousness which is out beginning. So now, the wisdom that realized emptiness, so this is the apprehender, we make that into the apprehended, we make it into the object. And another consciousness will now analyze that consciousness. So the wisdom that has realized emptiness, it now becomes the object of meditation. So it sounds complicated, it just means one mind is investigating another mind. One consciousness, another is investigating another consciousness. So this is the change that comes with this in the second. We now are investigating the wisdom realizing emptiness. Does it exist in the way that it appears? Is it empty of existing inherently? And so we've come to recognize it too is empty of existing inherently. How so? How do we recognize this? We recognize it through different ways. The first will be with the translation without beginning, in that consciousness is without beginning, meaning it arises in dependence. Independence, here we'll first look at dependence on parts, the parts being a preceding moment. And it will therefore, as the present moment has a preceding moment, it will necessarily have a subsequent, a following moment. So therefore, the consciousness cannot exist by way of its own nature or essence because it arises dependently. And first we look at dependence on parts, previous moment and subsequent moments. This means there is no inherent arising, no inherent abiding, and no inherent ceasing. So if you've learned about this elsewhere, you recognize here that we use this meditation to see that consciousness, by way of its own nature, cannot arise, abide, or cease. So this all comes in together with this translation of without beginning, because it comes about dependently, in particular here, on parts. Then the second way that we meditate that consciousness is empty of existing by way of its own inherent nature, because it is dependent, is to recognize that it's dependent on causes. And this is where we see that it's unborn, or it's not arisen, because it is not arisen by way of its own nature, but in dependence on many causes. Consciousness arises in dependence on causes. Consciousness also has parts. So therefore it's dependent on causes, consciousness is dependent on causes, and consciousness is dependent on parts. Therefore, to link back to the purpose of this meditation, this consciousness, which is the wisdom realizing emptiness, it too is empty of existing in the way that appears, empty of existing by way of its own nature, empty of existing inherently.
anda dondala disingi digi manzu che tamjeda yani yuda yujin ina ba du gore che kana jina yu chao yuda yujin ina du gore dine zada yugi che sonwa dang ane yujin jimbe yu che kana chine ji shen chi le due ne pa ji xia ba due ne zhu ba zama do shen gang le ma de ba ran yu ne zhu du gen sonwa dan jimbe yu che kan yo ma le se de nu sine da 제바 제네 도시 하고야지 대체상 돈다디 디시월다 간제래 소위기 주 송화당 유진 진바에 취 간대시네 송화의 진비 취 간대시네 갈라에 마디고 현실을 되는 주바마도 갈라에 마디고 랑응원이 주되고시 요 말에 세상 갈라에 마디고 랑응원이 주바 나와디 밀람 나시래 세지 온도 송월다 만이 유당 유전 간대시네 다 유전 간대시네 송화의 진비 취 유전 취 간대시네 라라 나이도 랑원이 주바 난거 나와 나신지 요 말이 나와디 밀람 나시래 세상다 돌드나 송화 유전 송화의 진비 취 간대시네 랑원이 주바서 자오기네 자 간대시 요래신 현실을 되는 주바지 요래서 되는 요래서 지금
So the conclusion one comes to in this meditation, with the first, now looking at both points, is that whatever one is investigating, we have all phenomena, so whether it is the self, or a material phenomenon, or another person, or, in the second point, the investigating consciousness itself, the wisdom realizing emptiness, when that apprehender becomes the apprehended, when that subject is made into the object that is investigated, we come to recognize that no phenomenon exists in the way that it appears, but as something separate or distinct, but rather is a dependent arising, or exists dependently, may appear as if it is independent, but whatever one is investigating, one comes to the same conclusion, that if it exists dependently. And as we saw now in the second point, with consciousness it exists dependent on both causes and parts. Therefore, consciousness too, the investigating consciousness too, can be likened to a dream, in that, just like in a dream, everything appears to us in a particular way, and then later when we awaken, we recognize, didn't exist in that way. So too with consciousness. But not just consciousness, with the second line, the first line too, any phenomenon that comes to mind does not exist in the way that it appears, just like a dream. Phenomena do not exist by way of their nature or essence, they only exist dependently.
안다디 만주게 현실의 되는 주바디 신고에다 예시모 시우 차고를 지산의 최근에 신 되는 주바에 세 되는 요얼마도 맞대 봐지 요 말에 세디 다디 갈래 가셔들이 당도 하고 고에디데 동번이 삼다디 제바진에 하고 에디다 예시모 시우 갈래 가셔 차되어와
I'm going to want to vocally acknowledge that this is really difficult to get. But one eventually needs to get to this recognition that all phenomena, so anything that comes to mind, only exists as a dependent arising. The way that it appears to us is mistaken. It does not exist in this way. So this is difficult to get. But with perseverance, you will.
키로지 키가시 키디키 가보리에서다 디키 나보리에서다 디키 세보리에서다 키리아 지고 타니 미라 샤고로 봐 지사다 나서 키세보다 나보다 키 가보세디 간에시다고 민다고 그래서는 거의 수부기 부기 도디 까부시나 딜레 기딜레 기까버스밍다 거래. 단 부기 도디 기 나보시여바나 부 나보시여바나 디 기딜레 기 나보스밍다 거래. 단 기기 부기 도디 세버시여나 기딜레 기 세버스다 거래. 세상 기딜레 기 세버다 나보 민다야디 그런 게 천도 가리여바네 니 견진 델레 뛰네 다고 마도 세상 기 세버다 나보다 까워세디 데니 그런 거 천도 분도를 맞대봐지 그런 외에 줍대봐지 요마다 디 뛰어냈다 거래 디가 저기 셈리아 차디 보라죠 데네 된다 말이야 아니 디 맞대죠 인내 기직부 직장 세보다 까보 수부 체쇼다 다직 체쇼다 직부 직장치 여바 있나 까보 세보 니바 쿠구질 바샤제 티제 기디 부차상 바바제 숨바 바제네 다 미치리야 지대네 디 기리가 기가고 그거래 나고 그거래 세고 그거래 랍네 그디 가고 세고 하면도 아직 그 부고라면도 기 갈라고 디 라야스면도 하세 디 라기마도 어디 기나고래 기가고 라야 말 그래서 그 뒤에 샤사기 깔 손도리 매려와다 제사다 디네 삼다베는 아주 기가고 나고 세고 샤바네 그런 게 분도 될 뒤에 샤바지마도 기가고 나고 세야지 컴퓨터를 맞고 그런 원인이 죽되어지 매발이야. 그런 원인이 죽되어지 여봐이나 부차상 샤제 장마장자学习 받이 된바네 디 나버레 디 가버레 디 세버레서 요거로 디와요 말와 민도아.
Give an illustration that is hopefully clear to understand how labeling works, or imputation. There are three words here: labeling, imputation, or designation. How this works. If you think of your dog at home, immediately there's a picture that comes to your mind, and your dog has a specific color. So let's say you have a white dog. The only reason you can say that is a white dog, or my dog is a white dog, is independence on the color of its fur. You cannot call a white dog, you cannot validly call a white dog a black dog. You can only validly call it a white dog because there is a reason to label it such. It's white fur. It's not a characteristic of that particular dog that makes it suitable to be called a white dog. Only independence on the color of its fur. Then let's say you go to maybe a shelter, a place where there are a number of dogs, and dogs that you do not know. And you're there, but when you arrive, they have shaved all the dogs. And you arrive and they're all completely bald. And now the owner of the shelter, I guess they're having a fun day, they ask you, okay, as a prize, if you can correctly identify the color of these dogs, you win a prize. Now the basis for how we can validly or correctly label those dogs is gone. We cannot say with certainty, yes, this is a white dog, a black dog, and so forth, because the basis for that labeling is gone. The basis for the labeling, or imputing by mind, labeling by mind, designating by mind, is gone. So this is how things exist. They exist in a particular way, independence on the mind labeling them.
디나시 당한 저기 곰 지경한 저기 lum비게 다 본부로 삼다베네 제사 당한 저기 네 지기 직대로 하다 당한 저기 다 본부 첨부 또 외쇼로제 프레미어세다 되는 구고를 받아 제사도 미딜의 외쇼로제 외마도 바도 콜제 본부디 지 프레미어세디 means 다고 말와 다 디니엘레고 프레미어 레베스는 말와 세상 고 프레미어 말을 라이로와 다 외쇼 루네 톱사회 질려고 미망의 잡교 외쇼 제도 잡교 제도 톱사회 질 거민 프레미어스다고 다고 프레미어 차사데 차상 프레미어 버스 고 하고 그러 다 뒤수 조서 바 뒤수 조서네 아직 마 아니 가소리 외쇼도 매바차네 고 양지 프레미어 말해라 그러 그래서 고 프레미어세 본부 뒤차에 민타에 되고 고 파이 외쇼 디 외쇼 토비 긴 델레테네 콜이야 파 따바스 프레미어세 따바스 마도 프레미어세디 마다바랑 when 두베지 매바래 랑 when 두 강래 마저바랑 when 두바지 여바이나 미 외쇼 마제바이네 고 프레미어제 제사베네 고 조사베네 프레미어제 인고고와 제가 강래 뭐되어 매봐서 가를 고 프레머야 차바데 가를 뛰고 와서 민망이 잡혀 오셔야 될 뛰고 오래 될 뛰네 아니고 민디 따고 와 제가 프레미어 세디 언주기 신랑의 뭐네 주버 매봐 제가 현실을 뛰네 파뢰 따파 좀 치시마 또 되는 시면 요 말해서
Another illustration. So we all have various labels that we identify with, titles perhaps. So how does it come about that one is suitable to be called in such a way? So let's take politicians, take the position of premier. For someone to be called a premier, they have to have achieved certain causes have to be accumulated. Without those causes having been accumulated, if someone walks around the streets demanding that they are addressed as the premier, people think they've gone a bit crazy. Or if an elected politician demands that they are to be called premier, when those causes haven't been accumulated, again, their colleagues will think this one is gone a bit crazy. But when an election has been won, and someone is now suitable to be labeled as premier, then they can now walk around feeling as a premier, be called and addressed by others validly as premier. And when a subsequent election is won or lost, then independent on those causes, this person then will continue to be known as the premier or will continue to be known as the former premier. So this is a clear example of how the various labels, titles that we have, or ways of referring to ourselves, can only come about independent on particular causes. If those causes are lacking, you have no real reason to call yourself that. If those causes are accumulated, then as long as those causes abide, then you can be called or known in a particular way.
안디네 다디나 신삼다 나간주 밀리아 삼다베나 미리리 민리리 쇼르 바다가 제베네 미실리아 미 민지 톰세지 미다요베나 다고 미딜리아 결혼 람세드리베슨 마레가 톰 레레그와 마레레그와 지산다 톰세디 강라에 마디고 랑의 뭐네 두버 레벨라나 다디 마레스 가르스니 되니 민 따와 좀 샤바레스 다 마디오바지 랑의 두버나 아메 제리니고 두고로와 제가 아메 제에도 거 가르수레스는 람 가르레스는 가라요 말에 부시레라 마도 생가라요 말 봐. 제가 예찬에 안에 파미게 다 수다반 될 민지 홀에 민지 처음서 다세에 제려 수인에다디 톰 라브고래. 제가 민 따바 뢰파 따바 좀 이샤바래 마도 제가 처음서디 마다 코랑기 원에 셀레 마도 코랑 원에 줍도지 말 코랑 원에 줍어이나 안에 기용도네 처음서 차고라디 요말다 수다베나 당고 기용도다 아니 그래서 부시레마도 디레스베 소소 수통네 디삼로 요마고 처음레스베 삼로 요마래 제가 뭐 처음서 민디 다세에 제려야 안다수도 어디 통해도 어디 처음레샤 처음 주고도 유대샤 얘기도세 시유로 제가 처음서디 강래마 랑원이 줍되어 말에 파울의 민다바 좀 샤바래서 제가 먼저 차산이다 디다니 소소 미리를 여러와다 차산줄로 다바 좀 샤바래마도 랑원이 줍되겐지 요마다.
So everyone here is known by a specific name. When you are introduced to someone, you are introduced by that specific name. And if you introduce by another name, you'll probably correct them and say, no, actually my name is this, not that. And why are you known in this way? Well, when you were born, your parents, they labeled you in this way. And they probably filled out some forms, but they labeled you in this way. And then they introduced you in this way into the world. They said, here is my darling child, and my darling child is called, perhaps, again they use this word, Trom. My darling child is called Trom. And then everyone that gets to know you knows you as Trom, before you even know this name yourself. And then later you grow up, and if you're now being introduced, and you introduce as Ram, then you would say, no, that's not my name is Trom. And likewise, every time someone says, "Oh, do you know Trump?" then you will appear to their mind. But if they say, "Do you know Ram?" you will not appear to their mind because you are not known in that way. So this is how we see that things exist in the way they do, independent on being validly labeled. We conclude then this morning with just repeating the essence or the conclusion one comes to in the meditation on these 2 points. Whatever phenomenon one is investigating, it appears to our mind as if it exists by way of its own nature, as if it's separate, distinct from other things because it's self-existent. But when we investigate, we see it doesn't exist in this way. It's empty of existing in this way. The only way that it can be said to exist is dependent, in particular, dependent on labeling by mind. Therefore, it can be said to be just like a dream. So in this way, this is a very brief summary of the meditation, where we see how something appears, we investigate it, we recognize it does not exist in the way that it appears, it's empty of it, that 3rd step, but it exists as a dependence arising, dependence on imputation, and the 5th step then, and therefore it's likened to a dream, that in a dream things appear in a certain way, but they do not exist in that way. So we can finish there and continue this afternoon. And thank you very much.